For decades, the IMF and the World Bank have used the cover of development and restructuring to plunder and loot the developing world. Now, as these institutions begin to set their sights on the struggling economies of Europe and other developed countries, economics professor and global research editor Michel Chossudovsky breaks down the true history of the economic crisis and the international financial structure. This is the GRTV feature interview with our special guest, Michel Chossudovsky.
Well, this crisis really started in the early 80s. It was characterized by what people called at that time the Reagan-Thatcher era. It was the beginning of the neoliberal onslaught of a package of economic policy measures, which was applied both in the developed countries, particularly Europe and North America, as well as in the developing countries in a somewhat different context. In the West, it was characterized by the concentration of corporate capital. Increased mergers and acquisitions took place in an atmosphere of deregulation of the real economy. It was also characterized by the beginning of austerity measures, the crisis of the social sectors, the welfare state, particularly in Western Europe. And eventually this evolved towards a major financial meltdown, first in 1981, as we recall, and again in 1987. What was characteristic of those two meltdowns was the absence of a regulatory environment. So that in a sense, what was happening was the scrapping of economic regulation, where the financial markets in agreement with the governments, I'm talking about Wall Street versus the US Treasury, essentially told the government, we will regulate ourselves, so that they had an internal process of regulation, but government regulation of financial occurrences, mechanisms, speculation was a no-no. And that has been the tendency, I would say, since 1987. It's the repeal of the regulatory environment, and it ultimately, the climax of that process is in 1999 with the adoption of what is called the Financial Services Modernization Act, adopted under the Clinton administration with Larry Summers at the time who was Secretary of the Treasury. And that's a big landmark because it's also the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which had been enacted during the Great Depression and which essentially purported to separate commercial banking from the activities of stock brokerage firms, in other words, the merchant banks, and to avoid instability which would result precisely from this speculative activity, insider trade, and so on. So that is the background. But I should mention another dimension of that period. 1980, or the early 80s, marks the onslaught of the debt crisis in developing countries. And it's not a coincidence that the Reagan-Thatcher era and the debt crisis coincide. It's part of a broader process of restructuring of the global economy. But what happened in the developing countries is very important because it also constitutes, in a sense, a dress rehearsal of things to come. The application of deadly macroeconomic reforms under the helm of the IMF and the World Bank, whereby indebted countries are obliged to subject themselves to massive austerity measures, but much more than that. The IMF would come in and would impose so-called conditionalities, close down your hospitals, cut your budgets, cut wages, fire workers in the public sector, privatize, a whole gamut of reforms which were initiated in the early 1980s and which resulted from essentially a debt crisis which affected mainly the countries which were producing raw materials for the world market, because those prices collapsed. They were facing a debt, and then they were subjected to these reforms. Now, one thing which was very important in the IMF reforms was the destabilization of currency markets. In other words, the demise of national currencies, so that when you trigger the demise of a national currency, essentially that country no longer has control of its main instruments of fiscal and monetary policy. And essentially the IMF triggered hyperinflations, even though their mandate is one of controlling inflation. But initially, when you intervene in a country and you trigger the collapse of the currency, immediately prices go fly high. Why? Because they're aligned with global a global price structure, and so domestic prices align themselves with international prices. So a devaluation of 50% will lead to a doubling of prices, of domestic prices, which in turn then leads to a collapse of real wages and impoverishment of millions of people. Now, I've been following those reforms right from the beginning, and I can assure you that what happens is that those reforms lead to the destruction of national economies. They literally they put the government in a straitjacket. They oblige the countries to abide by the conditions imposed by the IMF. The IMF takes control of the whole policy framework, and ultimately that process is also, in a sense, a precondition for the recolonization of these countries. Typically, it happened in the wake of independence movements, countries which asserted their sovereignty, the development of the non-aligned movement, and so on. But the early 80s is a process of economic recolonization through the imposition of these deadly reforms, which eventually lead to destroying national economies. And there's a certain evolution in that process. Early 80s, developing countries, in other words, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, are the targets. The late 80s, early 90s coincides with the end of the Cold War. And the targets of IMF World Bank policies then are Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, and the Balkans. And we see that very, very clearly, how economies are literally destroyed. I'll give you a couple of very important examples. 1991, the macroeconomic reforms imposed on Egypt at the height of the Gulf War, which implied the deregulation of the grain market, the lifting of trade barriers to the importation of grain, among other measures, led to the demise of the world's most ancient breadbasket, the Nile Valley. In other words, there you have an economy which is a breadbasket. It also has an industrial infrastructure, but it's self-sufficient in food. And the Nile Valley is an agricultural system which goes back several thousand years. What do? They destroy it. Today, Egypt imports a large share of its food from the rich countries. Why? Because those rich countries were able to destabilize the breadbasket and essentially dump commodity staples onto the Egyptian market. Another example, which is of a somewhat different nature, but which is comparable to Egypt, is 1994. The Ukraine, the breadbasket, of the former Soviet Union, an agricultural area producing grain staples, surplus grain economy. What happens? There's an agreement between the IMF and the Ukrainian government, but I should say that that government was already a proxy of the United States and Western Europe. What do they agree upon? They agree upon an increase, overnight increase of 900% of energy prices, both electricity and fuel. Now, this combined with a deregulation of trade. What happens? The breadbasket collapses because the increase in fuel prices essentially drives farmers into bankruptcy. Meanwhile, what happens is that American grain surpluses come into the Ukraine and replace the domestic supply emanating from this enormous, vast agricultural system. So that is the process of destabilization. It's one of 2 or 3 examples, but there are many, many more. Countries which are destroyed. Rwanda is a case in point. It's a small country, self-sufficient in food, and essentially combined with a civil war, but the imposition in 1990 of deadly reforms, right at the onslaught of a civil war, leads again to the demise of the agricultural system and the flooding of that economy with food aid and imported staples, which literally destroy the national economy. And there's one very pernicious way in which they do this, is that by obliging the countries to put taxes on fuel, they impose essentially a tariff on internal trade. So that, and I observed this when I was in Rwanda, the whole structure of internal trade collapses. It's cheaper to import from the European Union than to import 40 kilometers out of town. And this policy was not invented by the IMF. It was invented by the British East India Company when internal transit duties were applied to essentially to shunt the internal trade within India at a time, including at a time when Indian manufactured textiles were at a more advanced level than those of Britain. That was at the, let's say, at the height of the Industrial Revolution. So you can see how this manipulative environment is there to destroy country after country. We're not talking about a few countries. We're talking about over 100 countries were subjected to these reforms. In fact, all developing countries, in one form or another, with some exceptions, were subjected to these reforms. And those which did not abide by these reforms were then subjected to other forms of threat, including invasion, war, and so on. The cases of Libya, Syria, Iraq, countries which had oil reserves, which didn't need to accept the conditionalities of the IMF and the World Bank, but eventually they were invaded or they were threatened. And what I'd like to emphasize here is that there's an interface between economic manipulation and military action. It's not by accident that Paul Wolfowitz, who was with the Defense Department, #2 man in the Bush administration, is then sent to the World Bank and becomes the president of the World Bank. I mean, these are these institutions consult one another, and I was struck also that in the wake of the war in Yugoslavia in 1999, the World Bank had already drafted a reconstruction program, and it had drafted that reconstruction program 1 year before the actual military invasion, so that they had already staged the war, and they had the donors and the creditors coming in for reconstruction. The same thing occurred in Iraq and Afghanistan. What we are seeing today is in fact a third worldization of the developing countries, namely the application of the same macroeconomic medicine, possibly under a different institutional arrangement, although the IMF has been active in several of these countries. Iceland is another example of a country which was decimated by financial manipulation and the intervention, direct intervention of the IMF, so that we see the evolution of this process. In the 90s, when I was doing research on these IMF reforms, I stressed the fact that there was a duality, a sort of double standards, that between the high-wage economy and the low-wage economies, we didn't apply the same type of macroeconomic agenda. We impoverished the poor countries, drove them into bankruptcy, but we didn't apply the same neoliberal medicine to let's say Western Europe and the OECD countries, broadly defined. But today that duality has been scrapped. Okay, there are no double standards as far as the neoliberal agenda is concerned. In the high-wage countries, we impoverish, and we see this process occurring everywhere. Why? Because the medicine, the economic medicine which is proposed, is not the solution to the crisis, but the cause of the crisis.